There's something building right now that most people are completely underestimating. Not because it's the most extreme weather event of the year, but because of what came before it. This is the third cold wave to hit the Midwest and Northeast in the span of 10 days. And if you've been following this spring at all, you already know the first two were brutal. But here's what nobody is talking about. The third wave doesn't need to be the strongest to be the most damaging. In fact, it may be the most consequential cold event of this entire season, precisely because of how much damage already exists going into it. Let me take you back to the beginning of this spring, because to understand what's happening right now, you need the full picture. Not just this week, all of it. The year started with a polar vortex displacement in January, not a cold snap, a full displacement, the kind that sends Arctic air pouring deep into the continental United States. That event killed 22 people and caused $4 billion in damage. That is how 2026 began. Then came March, the warmest March recorded in 132 years. Fruit trees across the entire eastern belt, from Georgia up through New England, responded the way biology demands. They bloomed. 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule, pushed forward by warmth that felt like early summer and not like late winter. Then April arrived, and April didn't just stay warm. Philadelphia hit 91 degrees. Baltimore hit 93. These were not just warm spring days. These were summer temperatures in April, in cities that typically sit in the 60s and low 70s this time of year. And the vegetation responded. Every blossom opened. Every shoot extended. Every warm season crop that a gardener had been waiting to plant went into the ground. Because the evidence in front of them said, spring is here and winter is finished. It was not finished. Within days of that April heat, a cold front tore through the region and dropped temperatures 50 to 60 degrees in 24 to 48 hours. Not 50 degrees over a week, not a gradual transition. 50 to 60 degrees in 1 to 2 days, from summer warmth to late winter cold in a single weather cycle. That is not a seasonal transition. That is a meteorological whiplash, and it happened not once, but repeatedly across this spring. Wave 1 came in early May. Hard freezes of 28 degrees or below swept across the Dakotas and western Nebraska. Frost reached the Ohio Valley and the northern Texas Panhandle. For crops and orchards that had already leafed out and bloomed weeks ahead of schedule because of March and April's record warmth, this was a direct hit on fully exposed, zero-cold hardened tissue. Here is the agricultural science that explains why that matters so much, and why it keeps mattering with every wave that follows. When temperatures warm into the 80s and 90s in April, something specific happens inside a plant. The cold hardening that built up over winter, a physiological state where cells adjust their water content and membrane structure to resist freezing, breaks down completely. The plant is operating in full summer mode. It is growing aggressively. Every new shoot, every blossom, every developing fruitlet is produced on the assumption that cold temperatures are finished for the season. Then 30-degree air arrives 3 days after 90-degree warmth, and it finds tissue with zero cold hardening, no defense, no preparation. Because the warmth that came before told the plant summer was here. That is the specific mechanism that makes the warm to frost pattern so destructive. It is not the frost alone. It is the false security of the preceding warmth that stripped the plant of its defenses and left it fully exposed. Wave 1 delivered exactly this to orchards, vineyards, and vegetable gardens across the Midwest and Northeast. Ice crystals formed in the intercellular spaces of plant tissue. Cell membranes were damaged. The plant's ability to regulate water uptake and photosynthesis was compromised. Wave 2 followed just days later. Another round of below-normal temperatures across the eastern half of the country, confirmed in the Climate Prediction Center's 6 to 10-day outlook. And here is where the science becomes critical. The plants that faced Wave 2 were not the same plants that had faced Wave 1. In the days between the two cold events, the damaged tissue had been trying to repair itself. New cellular growth had emerged, but that new growth is tender, poorly hardened. In some ways, more vulnerable than the tissue that existed before the first frost ever arrived. The threshold for damage had dropped. What might have been a non-damaging 34-degree night in April became a damaging event on already stressed tissue in May. The plants were weaker going into Wave 2 than they were going into Wave 1. And now, Wave 3 is arriving this weekend. Frost advisory conditions, low to mid-30s, are forecast for portions of the Midwest and Northeast. Frosty mornings that, on any normal spring, on any healthy, cold, hardened vegetation, would be survivable. But this is not a normal spring, and this vegetation is not healthy. A plant that has survived 2 frost events in 10 days has been pushed through cumulative cold injury. The cellular damage accumulates. The energy reserves the plant needs to repair itself have been spent. And arriving now, on top of all of that, is a 3rd cold event. The threshold for lethal damage on some of this vegetation has dropped from 32 degrees down to 34, possibly 35. A frost advisory night in the mid-30s, the kind that would barely register in an average May, could push already compromised tissue past the point of recovery. Let me be specific about where the risk is highest and what is actually at stake, because the geographic footprint of Wave 3 aligns with some of the most agriculturally significant corridors in the eastern United States. Apple, peach, and cherry orchards across Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia are in the direct path of this frost threat. These orchards entered the fruitlet stage after April's record warmth accelerated bloom by 2 to 3 weeks. The pollinated blossoms have already set. Small green fruits are developing. Earlier than normal, yes, but they are there. Fruitlets are more frost-tolerant than open blossoms, but they are not immune. A hard freeze below 28 degrees can kill developing apple fruitlets outright. And a softer frost, 30 to 32 degrees, landing on fruitlets that have already been through 2 previous cold waves, can cause partial damage that reduces yield without completely destroying the crop. The economic reality of partial damage is brutal and almost never discussed in weather coverage. Partial crop loss is often more financially damaging than total crop loss, because the farmer still bears every dollar of production cost, but receives reduced revenue at harvest. An orchard that loses 40% of its fruit to cumulative cold injury still requires the same labor, the same fuel, the same equipment, and the same irrigation to bring the surviving crop to market. The math is unforgiving. It is the agricultural equivalent of paying for a full seat and receiving half a show. If you've ever experienced something like this before, let me know in the comments. Drop a like if this video helped you understand the situation better, and share this with someone you care about. Also subscribe because I bring new updates for you every day. The vineyards are facing a parallel story. The Finger Lakes wine region of New York, Hudson Valley, Virginia wine country, the Lake Erie AVA, across all of these growing corridors, grapevine shoots that survived the previous 2 frost waves are now carrying 4 to 6 inches of new growth, and every cold wave has forced the vine to redirect its energy. Instead of channeling resources into the primary buds, the ones that produce the best quality fruit, the vine has been compensating for damaged primary growth by activating secondary and tertiary buds. Those replacement buds yield less fruit, and fruit of lower quality. Wave 3, arriving now on vines already compensating for 2 previous cold events, threatens to push some of the region's most productive grape varieties past the point where they can produce an economically viable crop this season. Vineyard managers in the Finger Lakes, in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, in Pennsylvania's Lake Erie growing corridor, people who have been fighting this spring since late April, are facing the real possibility that this 3rd wave is the one that determines the character of the 2026 vintage. And then there are the home vegetable gardens. Every gardener across Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, and New England who planted tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, eggplant, basil, or squash in April's record warmth, and most of them did because April told them winter was over, is now facing a 3rd overnight frost threat. The plants that survived waves 1 and 2 are not the plants that went into the ground in April. They have been cold stressed repeatedly. Their cellular integrity is compromised. A tomato plant that loses its growing tip to frost in mid-May has already invested significant energy in root development and early canopy growth. That recovery time, the time it needs to regenerate, is time it simply does not have if a productive summer harvest is the goal. Moving north and west to the plains, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, the National Weather Service has issued freeze warnings across North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Minnesota. Temperatures expected to reach the low 30s to upper 20s in some areas. The winter wheat across the northern plains, already documented as being under freeze stress at its jointing stage during Wave 1, is now potentially facing a 3rd cold event at the boot stage, the most vulnerable period before heading. The cumulative stress of 3 cold waves during the critical spring growth period will show up in yield data when harvest arrives in June and July. USDA crop condition reporters across the northern plains are already watching closely. There is some genuinely hopeful science emerging from this difficult spring, and it deserves attention. A company is actively testing a biodegradable, lightweight protective foam that can be applied to fruit trees, berry bushes, and row crops to create a thermal buffer against overnight temperature drops. The foam insulates plant tissue in a way that mimics several inches of snow cover, trapping the soil's residual warmth around vulnerable growing points and preventing the convective heat loss that drives radiation frost damage. This technology is not yet commercially available at scale. It is still in testing phases. But the fact that it is being developed and tested in direct response to what this spring has done, the repeated damaging temperature swings, the warm-to-frost oscillations, is significant. It represents the agricultural community responding in real time to a problem that is becoming harder to plan around. The old framework, plant after your average last frost date and you will be fine, is no longer a reliable guide in an era of amplified temperature swings like the ones that have defined 2026. For home gardeners who do not have access to commercial protection systems, the underlying physics are identical. Create a thermal buffer between the plant and the cold air. Row covers, frost cloth, cold frames, overturned buckets placed over individual seedlings before sunset. All of these trap enough soil warmth to provide meaningful frost protection through a frost advisory night. The key word is before sunset. By the time visible frost has formed on your plants, the temperature has already held at or below 32 degrees long enough to have caused damage. The window to protect is before the temperature falls, not after the frost appears. Here is what that looks like practically. If you have warm season vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, basil, beans, anywhere in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, or New England, cover them tonight before you go to sleep. Not in the morning. Tonight. Use whatever you have. Row covers work best. Frost cloth works. Old bed sheets work. Plastic sheeting held off the foliage works. The goal is not to create a perfect seal. The goal is to trap the warmth that is built up in the soil through the day and hold it around the plant tissue through the cold hours of early morning. Check the National Weather Service frost advisory and freeze warning status for your specific county. Not your state, not your region, your county. The frost boundary is not a smooth line across the map. It follows terrain, urban heat islands, lake effect patterns, and local topography in ways that create significant variation within a single metropolitan area. A county 5 miles away from yours can have a freeze warning while you have only a frost advisory, or nothing at all, depending on elevation and proximity to open water. Know your county. Look it up. It takes 30 seconds. One more thing that needs to be addressed because it creates real confusion about risk and preparedness every time frost occurs in May. People check their average last frost date, see that this date has passed, and conclude they are safe. This spring has demonstrated repeatedly and definitively that is not how last frost dates function. The average last frost date for your location is the date on which 50% of years historically have seen their last freeze. That means in 50% of years, frost has occurred after that date. The average last frost date is not a guarantee. It is the midpoint of a historical distribution. And in a year like 2026, where the temperature pattern has been defined by 50 to 60 degree swings, by a Canadian cold trough that has remained active deep into May, by an atmospheric circulation pattern far outside the normal range, the probability of late-season frost is significantly elevated above average year expectations. The soil temperature picture matters here too, and it is almost never discussed in frost coverage. The overnight air temperatures that drive frost advisories tell you about damage risk to plant tissue, but soil temperature tells you whether transplanted warm-season crops can actually establish and grow productively. After 3 cold waves in May on top of April's heat, soil temperatures across the Ohio Valley and Northeast are inconsistent. Some locations have warm soils from April's warmth. Others have been repeatedly cooled by cold air penetrating the surface. Warm-season crops transplanted into soil below 60 degrees Fahrenheit will struggle to establish regardless of whether the air temperature actually damages their foliage. Both conditions matter. Both need to be checked. Check the National Weather Service frost advisory and freeze warning status for your specific county. Not your state, not your region, your county. The frost boundary is not a smooth line across the map. It follows terrain, urban heat islands, lake effect patterns, and local topography in ways that create significant variation within a single metropolitan area. A county 5 miles away from yours can have a freeze warning while you have only a frost advisory, or nothing at all, depending on elevation and proximity to open water. Know your county. Look it up. It takes 30 seconds. One more thing that needs to be addressed because it creates real confusion about risk and preparedness every time frost occurs in May. People check their average last frost date, see that this date has passed, and conclude they are safe. This spring has demonstrated repeatedly and definitively that is not how last frost dates function. The average last frost date for your location is the date on which 50% of years historically have seen their last freeze. That means in 50% of years, frost has occurred after that date. The average last frost date is not a guarantee. It is the midpoint of a historical distribution. And in a year like 2026, where the temperature pattern has been defined by 50 to 60 degree swings, by a Canadian cold trough that has remained active deep into May, by an atmospheric circulation pattern far outside the normal range, the probability of late-season frost is significantly elevated above average year expectations. The soil temperature picture matters here too, and it is almost never discussed in frost coverage. The overnight air temperatures that drive frost advisories tell you about damage risk to plant tissue, but soil temperature tells you whether transplanted warm-season crops can actually establish and grow productively. After 3 cold waves in May on top of April's heat, soil temperatures across the Ohio Valley and Northeast are inconsistent. Some locations have warm soils from April's warmth. Others have been repeatedly cooled by cold air penetrating the surface. Warm-season crops transplanted into soil below 60 degrees Fahrenheit will struggle to establish regardless of whether the air temperature actually damages their foliage. Both conditions matter. Both need to be checked. For fruit orchard managers in the Great Lakes and Appalachian Fruit Belt, the most critical task today, before Wave 3 arrives, is assessing the damage that already exists from Waves 1 and 2. Cut cross-sections of developing fruitlets. Look for browning at the seed cavity or embryo. That browning is the signature of freeze-killed tissue. Know your existing damage percentage before the next cold night arrives. That number matters for crop insurance documentation, for irrigation and thinning decisions, and for understanding exactly how much additional loss Wave 3 can pile onto what already exists. For the northern plains, the Dakotas, Nebraska, northern Kansas, cities under freeze warning include Grand Forks, Williston, Dickinson, Bismarck, and Crosby, with temperatures forecast to fall as low as 29 degrees. Protect any outdoor plumbing that is exposed to those temperatures. Protect transplanted seedlings, and continue monitoring winter wheat fields for cumulative freeze injury at the boot stage. Here is where we stand as of this weekend. Wave 3 is arriving. The frost advisory range, low to mid-30s, is less extreme than the hard freeze conditions that characterized Wave 1 across the northern plains. That is the silver lining, and it is real. But mid-30s on healthy, cold-hardened vegetation in an average May is a very different event than mid-30s on vegetation that has been through 2 cold waves in 10 days, on tissue whose cold tolerance threshold has already dropped, on crops whose cellular integrity has been compromised by repeated stress. The cumulative cold injury story of the 2026 spring is the defining agricultural story of this season. It moves quietly. It doesn't generate dramatic radar signatures or storm chaser footage. It just arrives in the dark on a still Friday night. And by Saturday morning, the tomato plant you spent 3 weeks growing from seed under your grow lights, that you hardened off carefully, that you watched survive 2 previous cold scares, is black and collapsed. The atmosphere that produced the January polar vortex, the record March warmth, the April heat wave, and now 3 cold waves inside of 10 days in May, that atmosphere does not quiet down because you are exhausted by the swings. It keeps oscillating. The temperature roller coaster of this spring is still running, and the next descent is tonight. Cover your plants before you sleep. Check your orchard in the morning. Know your county's frost advisory status through the weekend, and understand that the best protection you have right now is the one you put in place before the temperature drops, not after you see the damage. Stay safe, protect what you have grown, and I will see you in the next update.